If you walk into a 1972 living room today, you'll know within 5 seconds that you've stepped backward in time. Not because of the colors, because of 15 specific objects that have been quietly removed from every American home ever built since 1990. Here they are. One clarification before we start. Some of these things still exist. You can find them in older homes, in apartments, at estate sales. What they've vanished from is new construction and the current design conversation. The houses being built right now, the rooms being photographed for magazines, the standard of what a living room is supposed to look like. That's the distinction that matters here. Start with the most dramatic one. In 1927, an architect named Bruce Goff designed a home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a semicircular pit cut into the living room floor around a fireplace. Guests sat inside it. That was unusual enough at the time that none of the major architectural publications bothered to cover it. 30 years later, the concept finally broke into the mainstream. In 1957, a house was completed in Columbus, Indiana, the Miller House, designed by Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen, with interiors by Alexander Gerard. Gerard put a 15-foot square seating pit into the center of the living room, accessed by 3 steps down from the main floor, lined with richly colored cushions that changed from deep red in winter to lighter shades in summer. J. Irwin Miller, the industrialist who commissioned the house, hosted business leaders and politicians there. Architectural Forum published it soon after and described the feature as a lounge pit. That framing, unintentionally, made it sound irresistible. Within years, the sunken living room appeared in model homes coast to coast. The New York Times started mentioning conversation pits regularly. Period commentary captured the appeal directly. The pit solved a problem that larger, conventionally furnished living rooms couldn't: a fixed arrangement for actual face-to-face conversation. One modular pit sofa retailed for $2,000 in 1976, roughly $11,000 today. That's the price of a piece of furniture specifically designed to trap people in a circle and make them talk to each other. Mary Richards had a sunken living room in her Minneapolis apartment on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which ran from 1970 to 1977. James Bond films used them. Architects installed them in airports, restaurants, and hotel lobbies. By the early 1980s, they were gone. 3 things killed them. People kept falling in. Time magazine ran an article in 1963 cataloging the hazards, and by the late 1970s, stumbling off the edge at a party had become a documented feature of living with one. Built-in seating couldn't be rearranged. Once you had the circular sofa was permanent. Most tellingly, living rooms were reorganizing themselves around television viewing, and the pit's fixed orientation was designed for conversation, not for a screen mounted on one wall. Homeowners filled them in with concrete and moved on. Before streaming, before Wi-Fi, before flat panels, a living room had to accommodate a specific and complicated ecology of devices. The television was one box. The stereo receiver was another. The turntable needed a stable surface. VHS tapes needed storage. Vinyl records required upright shelving. Books, decorative objects, and framed photos filled whatever remained. Every component ran its own cable, drew its own power, generated its own heat. The wall unit was the piece of furniture built to hold all of it. By the early 1990s, Ethan Allen and a range of similar furniture retailers were selling floor-to-ceiling wooden cabinets, some spanning an entire wall, with compartments precisely scaled to a CRT television, a component receiver, a tape deck, and record storage below. They were status items. One period survey of aspirational consumer goods lists a home entertainment center with a JBL Ultra alongside luxury cars as a marker of having arrived. Then, in sequence, everything the wall unit was built to hold stopped existing. CRT televisions became flat panels, needing 8 inches of depth instead of 24. Physical media gave way to streaming. Cables gave way to wireless signals. The wall unit was furniture built around a problem that technology simply dissolved. What replaced it's a bracket screwed into drywall and a soundbar on a small shelf below. The ceiling wasn't always a flat white surface. For roughly 25 years in American residential construction, starting in the early 1950s, it was textured. Spray applied with a mixture that included calcite, perlite, gypsum, and, critically, chrysotile asbestos fibers at concentrations between 1 and 10%. The texture serves 2 purposes: It absorbed sound and covered imperfect drywall work without requiring skilled finishing. In 1978, the EPA banned spray-applied surfacing materials containing asbestos. Existing inventories were exempt, so contractors could legally install asbestos-bearing product through the early 1980s. The practical effect was that homes built before 1980 should be treated as potentially containing asbestos in their ceiling texture, and millions of them still do. The removal industry that grew in the aftermath became its own economy. Scraping off a standard popcorn ceiling is straightforward work. Scraping off one that contains asbestos requires containment, protective equipment, and licensed disposal. A feature installed to make construction cheaper became, for subsequent owners, a liability requiring professional remediation before renovating or selling. New homes stopped getting the texture. What's still overhead in tens of millions of older homes is a record of the gap between when a product was banned and when the last of it was used up. Invented in 1952 by brothers Edward and Frederick Bopp, vertical blinds were an engineering solution to a specific architectural problem. Horizontal blinds couldn't span the width of a sliding glass door. The slats were too long and too heavy to hang properly across a 6 or 8-foot opening. Vertical blinds solved this by rotating the vanes 90 degrees, hanging individual slats from a top track that could extend as wide as needed. They peaked in the 1980s. Off-white PVC vanes, fabric-wrapped versions in neutral tones, the mechanical sound they made when you walked through them or turned the wand. That sound places a room in a decade without anyone saying a word. They didn't disappear. They're still in apartments and rental properties across the country, still solving the same sliding door problem they were designed to solve in 1952. What changed is that fabric panels, cellular shades, and plantation shutters replaced them wherever the owner had a choice. They became a marker of impermanence, the window treatment of a place you're renting, not a home you've decorated. That slide from practical solution to signal of transience happened entirely within one generation. The sofa had plastic on it, not temporarily, permanently. You sat down and your legs stuck to it in summer. You stood up and it made a sound. This practice was documented specifically in Italian-American and Eastern European immigrant communities. The Tenement Museum has addressed it directly. The academic journal Society of Americanist Review published a survey of Italian-American material culture that identified the plastic-covered couch as a vernacular preservation strategy. The logic was straightforward. Furniture was expensive, meant to last, and sometimes intended as inheritance. Displaying it was the whole point, and displaying it meant keeping it pristine, which meant covering it. What ended the practice wasn't better furniture care habits. Furniture became cheap enough to replace rather than preserve, and the preservation logic dissolved with it. The people who practiced it understood something about permanence that later decades decided wasn't worth sitting on plastic for. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, a specific shade of gold-tone metal was on almost every surface of the American living room: brass. One industry estimate places its share of the decor market at roughly 70% during this period. That concentration, if accurate, represents a near-total dominance, a single material finish across an entire industry simultaneously. The evidence is visible in any house from the era: brass drawer pulls on oak cabinets, brass hinges, door handles, picture frames, brass floor lamps, brass fireplace screens, the mesh curtain style that hung in front of the firebox, rippling slightly when you walked past. Builders installed it as a standard upgrade. Retailers promoted it as a mark of quality. It read as warm, affluent, and current. Chrome displaced it in the 1990s. Brushed nickel followed in the 2000s. Matte black arrived in the 2010s. Each transition was fast and complete, the previous finish becoming, almost overnight, a date stamp for the decade it had belonged to. Before the entertainment center, and distinct from it, there was a piece of furniture that contained music. Not a speaker, not a component. A complete system inside a single wooden cabinet, styled to match the rest of the room's furniture. The hi-fi console, at its peak in the late 1950s through the early 1960s, looked like a sideboard or a credenza. It sat against the wall on tapered legs. Inside were a turntable, an AM/FM tuner, an amplifier, and speakers, all integrated, all concealed. Magnavox was among the first companies to market solid-state stereo consoles in this form, as Life magazine noted in 1963. Zenith produced them throughout what audio historians describe as the golden age of American hi-fi, the early to mid-1960s. Some Magnavox units housed 15-inch woofers and amplifiers producing up to 300 watts. That's serious audio engineering inside what looked, to a visitor, like a dining room furniture piece. Vacuum tubes in earlier units generated heat and required airflow, which is partly why the cabinets were large and vented. As transistors replaced tubes, components shrank. Component separates, a separate receiver, separate turntable, separate speakers, became affordable, and the hi-fi press promoted them as the sophisticated choice. The console was recast as a compromise, then as obsolete, then as something you donated. The furniture that housed a complete sound system was replaced by a shelf. American homes built between the 1920s and the 1970s sometimes had a small architectural recess built into the hallway or living room wall. A shallow alcove, occasionally with a narrow bench beside it, designed for a single specific object: the telephone. Period real estate advertising in the Pacific region promoted built-in telephone facilities as a residential selling point. The telephone was heavy, hardwired to the wall, and the household's single point of voice communication. It deserved a designated architectural place. The bench beside the nook had a name: the gossip bench. You sat down when a call came in. Beneath the shelf, in most implementations, was space for the phone directories, white pages and yellow pages, updated annually and deposited on the front porch by the phone company. The whole assembly was infrastructure, like the mailbox, built to serve a technology assumed to be permanent. Cordless phones, common by the late 1980s, made the fixed location irrelevant. Mobile phones, arriving in mass market form through the 1990s and 2000s, eliminated the landline itself. What remained was a small recess in a hallway wall with no obvious function. Some houses still have them. They hold keys now, or candles, or a small plant. The architecture outlasted the device it was built to serve. In 1953, a man named Marvin Middlemark, working in Rego Park, Queens, invented the rabbit ear television antenna. It was a dipole antenna, two adjustable metal rods extending from a base, designed to sit on top of the television set and receive broadcast signals transmitted over the air. CBS News recorded his birth date, September 16, 1919, because he invented something that touched enough American living rooms to be worth noting when he died in 1989. The ritual rabbit ears required is one of the most universally remembered experiences of pre-cable television. The picture would drift into static, or ghosts, a doubled, translucent image of whatever you were trying to watch. Someone would stand up and angle the rods. The picture would improve, then degrade. Someone would be told to stand in exactly that spot and hold the antenna at exactly that angle, and they would stand there, motionless, through the rest of the program. Aluminum foil wrapped around the tips was a widely remembered trick, extending the effective receiving surface. At the neighborhood scale, a rooftop antenna mast served the same function. A pole on the chimney or peak of the roof connected to the television by a cable running through an exterior wall. By 1960, roughly 90% of American households had television sets. Most depended on over-the-air reception. Cable penetration grew substantially through the 1980s, and by the early 2000s, rabbit ears had been largely superseded. The New York Times covered the analog to digital broadcast transition in 2009 under the headline, "Goodbye Rabbit Ears." The cord-cutting movement brought a partial revival. Over-the-air digital reception via antenna is free, which turns out to matter. But the adjustment ritual, the standing in exactly the right spot, belongs to the previous century. At some point between the 1930s and the 1970s, the American living room contained a piece of furniture with no modern equivalent: the smoking stand, a floor-standing pedestal, typically 18 to 24 inches tall, with an ashtray bowl mounted on top and sometimes a built-in lighter at the base. Some versions were chrome and slag glass, the kind of material found in hotel cigar rooms. Others were brass and wood. A few were cast in Art Deco forms that now sell on First Dibs for collecting purposes. Roughly 35 are currently listed there. Furniture historians place the smoking stand's heyday in the Depression era of the 1930s. It remained common through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, and by the 1970s was already described in reference sources as a relic, even as indoor smoking remained socially accepted. Its presence in a room was hospitality signaling. You kept a smoking stand in the living room because you expected guests to smoke and wanted them to be comfortable doing so. Its absence now marks a reversal so complete it's easy to forget it was ever the default. The room that once maintained dedicated furniture for the act now prohibits the act entirely, and the transition between those two conditions happened inside a single lifetime. Many American households had two living rooms. Not architecturally, there was only one formal space, but functionally. There was the room the family actually used, and there was the room nobody used. The formal living room, sealed off by pocket doors or simply by convention, was kept in permanent readiness for company. The furniture was pristine, sometimes still under plastic. The carpet was untrafficked, candy dishes were filled, pillows were arranged. A period source on American domestic practice captured it without irony. The formal parlor has been kept shut up as a dead property. The family gathered in the den or family room at the back of the house. The front room was theater. This practice had European roots. The parlor tradition of the 19th century filtered through immigrant aspiration and working-class ideas about respectability. Academic research on post-war domestic space documents it across multiple ethnic communities, noting that certain rooms were more or less off-limits except to service personnel. The formal space was proof of having arrived somewhere worth displaying. It's the same cultural logic as the plastic furniture cover, expressed architecturally instead of materially. Preservation of something too important to use. Open-plan floor plans made it impossible to maintain. When the kitchen flows into the dining area, which flows into the living space, there's no room to seal off. The walls that created the formal-informal distinction were among the first things removed when builders and design media decided mid-century formality was done. The family room, which academic housing history identifies as one of the defining domestic additions of mid-century American residential design, absorbed the formal room's space and purpose simultaneously. It stood beside the sofa or near the armchair. Wicker in some houses, wrought iron in others, chrome tube construction in the more modernist interiors. Its contents were specific and rotated on a known schedule. The weekly TV guide, the monthly Reader's Digest and National Geographic, perhaps Better Homes and Gardens. Older issues went to the back. Current issues stayed in front. This was an information delivery system that operated on physical logic. Periodicals arrived at known intervals, accumulated, and needed a place to live while they were current. Reader's Digest reached peak circulation in the tens of millions during the mid-20th century. National Geographic was in an estimated 40 million American homes by the 1980s. These weren't casual purchases. They were subscriptions, expected and managed, and the rack managed them. The periodical industry didn't disappear cleanly. It eroded. Individual magazines folded or shrank. Digital news replaced the weekly information rhythm with a continuous one. When there were no periodicals arriving on a schedule, there was no reason to own the furniture that managed them. The magazine rack survives mainly as a mid-century decorative object, bought at antique stores for visual interest, and emptied of its original function. By 1960, roughly 90% of American households had television sets. Most of those sets weren't appliances in the modern sense, small black rectangles to be wall-mounted and forgotten. They were furniture. The console television was a wood-veneered cabinet, standing on legs, housing the tube behind doors or a fabric grill, designed to occupy a specific place in the room with the visual weight of a sideboard or a bookcase. Magnavox, Zenith, RCA, Philco all produced consoles throughout the 1950s and 1960s in named furniture styles: Early American, French Provincial. The television was considered a permanent acquisition, like a piano, and treated accordingly. Period accounts describe the console TV cabinet as a status symbol in the 60s and 70s, a piece of furniture whose style communicated something about the household that owned it. The transition to portable sets, smaller, lighter, affordable enough to put in a bedroom or kitchen, began in the early 1970s. Flat panel technology completed the transformation. A television 3 inches deep can't be furniture. It becomes an appliance, which is to say, a tool rather than a possession. The wall mount replaced the cabinet. The thing that had required furniture-level treatment for 30 years was reduced to a bracket and some drywall anchors. The 1970s American home was carpeted, but not uniformly. Each room had its own. The living room might be a sculptured cut pile in harvest gold. The hallway connected it to the dining room via a runner, a narrower strip of coordinating or contrasting carpet laid over the main floor. Avocado, burnt orange, rust, and mustard were the documented palette of the period. A design language so specific that a single swatch can place a room in a 5-year window. This room-by-room carpeting created physical transitions. You moved from one texture or color to another as you moved through the house. Rooms were distinct spaces with distinct floors. The runner in the hallway was both a connector and a protector, absorbing traffic between the more carefully maintained rooms on either side. Open-plan design dismantled the room boundaries that made this logic possible. When the living room opens directly into the kitchen and dining area, you can't carpet them independently. Wall-to-wall carpet retreated, replaced by hardwood or engineered wood throughout, with area rugs placed to define zones that walls no longer defined. The runner and the room-specific carpet went with the walls. The living room wall wasn't always painted. For much of the period between 1955 and 1985, it was papered, and the paper came in 3 distinct types, each with its own character and decade association. Floral wallpaper was the most common, printed paper with botanical motifs, often with a coordinating border at the ceiling line, covering millions of living rooms from the 1950s through the mid-1970s. Foil wallpaper was its more aggressive contemporary. Metallic mylar backing gave it a reflective surface that caught light and movement. Period textile research documents flock paper applied directly onto shiny mylar backing as a distinct 1970s product, the velvet texture of the flock against the metallic backing, producing something that read as expensive and emphatically of its moment. Flock wallpaper was the most formal. Velvet texture raised pile, typically in deep jewel tones, burgundy, forest green, navy, associated with rooms meant to impress. A 19th century study of American parlor making notes green flocked wallpaper as a defining element of the formal domestic interior, and the material persisted in aspirational living rooms well into the mid-century. All 3 required paste. They required soaking, careful seam matching, and hours of installation. When paint became cheap, fast, and available in hundreds of colors, the labor case for wallpaper collapsed. A modest revival is underway in current design media, treated as a statement accent rather than a room-covering default. That's a genuinely different thing from what it was. Walk into any new home built today and you'll find none of these. Not one. The living room has been stripped to its frame. Whether that's progress depends on what you think living rooms are for. Subscribe for more stories like this.